Our reading today is from the Divinity School address by Ralph Waldo Emerson, delivered in 1838 to the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School. This is a short excerpt. Whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshiper defrauded and disconsolate. We shrink as soon as the prayers begin, which do not uplift, but smite and offend us. We are fain to wrap our cloaks about us and secure as best we can a solitude that hears not. I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say I would go to church no more. Men go, thought I, where they are wont to go, else had no soul entered the temple in the afternoon. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real. The preacher, merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him and then out of the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of the snow. He had lived in vain. He had no one word intimating that he had laughed or wept, was married or in love, had been commended or cheated or chagrined. If he had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. The capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth, he had not learned. Not one fact in all his experience had he yet imported into his doctrine. This man had plowed and planted and talked and bought and sold. He had read books, he had eaten and drunken, his headaches, his heartthrobs, he smiles and suffers, yet was there not a surmise, a hint in all the discourse that he had ever lived at all? Not a line did he draw out of real history. The true preacher can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life. Life passed through the fire of thought. But of the bad preacher, it could not be told from his sermon what age of the world he fell in, whether he had a father or a child, whether he was a freeholder or a pauper, whether he was a citizen or a countryman, or any other fact of his biography. It seems strange that the people should come to church. It seemed as if their houses were very unentertaining, that they should prefer this thoughtless clamor. It shows that there is a commanding attraction in the moral sentiment that can lend a faint tint of light to dullness and ignorance, coming in its name and place. The good hearer is sure he has been touched sometimes, is sure there is somewhat to be reached, and some word that can reach it. When he listens to these vain words, he comforts himself by their relation to his remembrance of better hours, and so they clatter and echo unchallenged.
From the Sublime, I learned the hard way, never preach against Emerson. It was a few years ago back in Delaware. One Sunday, I got it into my head, we Unitarian Universalists hold Emerson in too high esteem. He needs to be taken down a peg or two. I figured this thesis might just make for an interesting sermon. And it was interesting, but not for the reasons I intended. The morning came for me to mount the pulpit, as we say. I was in a harried state because I had been running late all morning long. I couldn't actually feel present and in the moment that day. About midway through the service, I misplaced my order of service under a stack of papers under the pulpit. Fortunately, I had found the previous week's order of service so that I could follow the flow of the liturgy, which worked fine until I realized I had to announce that Sunday's hymns and hadn't memorized what it was for that week. By the time it came to actually preach, I noticed that my manuscript had become scattered since I was looking for that stupid order of service all over the pulpit. I kept losing my place and had to scramble around to find the next page that had somehow gotten scattered into this pile. It was in the midst of one of these awkward pauses when I was trying to find the right page that the pulpit microphone died. Wireless mics with batteries that die work on radio waves. There's a broadcast signal that goes out and the mic pings it back and you have a connection. However, if the microphone runs out of juice, the signal just keeps going out and out and out until it finds something to connect with. 2/3 of the way through this sermon, in which I was criticizing Emerson, I found myself shouting in order to be heard because my mic wasn't working. That's in those moments where I could actually find my place in this scattered manuscript. Then mercifully, towards the end of the service, we started to hear voices and strange sounds coming through the sound system. Someone later told me, who happened to be a pilot, that the sound system's receiver was picking up an airplane a few hundred feet above us on approach to the Philadelphia International Airport, talking to the tower. Not exactly the benediction I had envisioned for that particular service, though perhaps it was a worthy one. Now, I'm not known for being a superstitious man. However, ever since that sermon, I've not had the courage to tempt fate and preach on Emerson again. That is, until today. With my luck, Dave Morkel, our technical director for this morning, will probably have some catastrophic thing happen later on in this service. And if that happens, be prepared for it. It was Shakespeare who penned the words that are my title this morning, "To thine own self be true." It is, of course, from Polonius's famous monologue in Hamlet. Polonius is passing on this fatherly advice to his son Laertes. Laertes is about ready to head off to France. Polonius is telling him to avoid the decadent pleasures of the flesh there. Essentially, he's saying, behave yourself, even if I'm not there to watch over you. Be true to the ethical standards to which you have been raised. You are Danish royalty, please act like it. Later on in the play, Polonius even sends a spy to make sure that Laertes is being true to himself while in France. It's a phrase that has evolved over time. Shakespeare's original use of the line is far less interesting than our own modern colloquialism. In our current usage, "to thine own self be true" is the ultimate expression of the authentic life. Be true to yourself. It's almost a foreshadowing of Jungian psychology. Find the true self, transcend your ego, follow the calling of your soul. Emerson takes this a step further to say, not only should you follow the call of your soul, but you should not be afraid or ashamed to express it either. In our reading this morning, he proclaims that such an expression is the very essence of his chosen profession, ministry. Interestingly, Emerson gave this exhortation to the graduating class of Harvard Divinity School in 1838. The anecdote of the preacher droning on and on and on with his sermon while there was a snowstorm outside was a real thing that happened. A colleague of mine in suburban Philadelphia once had me over to his church to preach, and the entire chancel, everything behind the minister that the congregation was facing in that sanctuary, is surrounded in glass to take advantage of the fact that there was this wooded area that the church occupied. And I joked with him that Sunday that I hope no snowstorms pop up or I might appear merely spectral by comparison. He laughed and said, anytime a deer wanders out of this woods, all worship stops immediately. Emerson was at the end of his ministerial career when he gave this address. In fact, he accepted the invitation to speak to the graduating class just a week or two after resigning his post in East Lexington. It's unclear if the people hearing the address knew who this preacher was that Emerson was talking about. Actually, he was indicting the entire church in his critique, not merely one individual. But we know from Emerson's journals that he attended the church in Concord, Massachusetts, when not in his own pulpit, and he regularly heard the preaching of one Barzillai Frost. Now, Emerson doesn't call out Frost by name in the address, but we can guess pretty closely who he's talking about. Unitarians in New England were a pretty small group in those days. You have to figure someone put two and two together to know who he meant. Even at his funeral, one of Barzillai Frost's best friends said this about him. Doubtless, you all early felt that there was neither flexibility of voice, nor play of imagination, nor gush of emotion to give him, as a preacher, that power to which other endowments fairly empowered him. That is a very polite way to put it. Frost preached in a loud monologue. Emerson was far less generous, describing Frost's style in his journals as a, quote, a ragged, half-screaming bass. Barzillai Frost was a famously bad preacher. Now, Emerson left the ministry to join the professional lecture tour known as the Lyceum. So preaching was very important to him. Beyond delivery style, what irked Emerson was that there was nothing of the man in the sermon. Frost could spit back at you all the ins and outs of various philosophers and theologians, but where was his perspective on life? How did he relate his personal experience to being human to the great doctrines of the Unitarian and Christian tradition? That was really at the crux of things. For Emerson, it isn't enough to be able to proclaim Jesus or Shakespeare or Plato as the ultimate messenger of truth. He wants to know, in what way are you a bard for the divine truths that flash through your consciousness, as he says in another part of the Divinity School address? Regardless of whether you are a minister or not, the life of faith is one lived according to these insights. He urges us to be fearless enough to proclaim them to the world, even if they are unpopular. They are unique expressions of the self. To thine own self be true, we might hear Emerson respond with the bard's wisdom in Polonius's mouth. Here again, some of Emerson's exhortations from the Divinity School address. But this time, instead of relegating his words to history, something he said to other people about ministers a long time ago, this time hear them as instructions to all Unitarian Universalists throughout history. We are all called to do these things, the capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth he had not learned. Or another juicy one, the true preacher can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. That is the essence of authenticity, that our values and beliefs are congruent with our actions. I think of authenticity as being the exact opposite of hypocrisy. We are engaged in an authentic faith when our actions are in line with what we believe and what we say we believe. It is with that definition of authenticity firmly in mind that we can perhaps return to our poor friend, Barzillai Frost. Yes, Emerson eviscerated him for being a poor preacher, but Frost spent his entire career, nearly 3 decades, serving the conquered church. How could that be? How could someone who failed to, quote, convert their life into truth stay on so long? Well, it turns out Frost was excellent at pastoral visitations. He would regularly call upon the 300 families that attended his church. Barzillai Frost was active in the community and a leader in the temperance and anti-slavery movements. Note that this was a period of time when anti-slavery was not popular position, even in New England. Frost was courageous enough to be a leader there. He looked after his colleagues. When one student at Harvard Divinity School was in jeopardy of not graduating with his class and almost didn't get to hear Mr. Emerson preach this address, who spent 2 months tutoring this student in the philosophy of John Locke and other important thinkers of the day? Barzillai Frost did. To call him merely spectral is perhaps too harsh a judgment. I get that preaching is a high-profile aspect of the minister's job. My family, my father in particular, who grew up in doing hard labor on the family dairy farm in rural Michigan, likes to tease me saying that I only work 1 day a week. They fall into the same trap that Emerson does. Ministry is far more than preaching. Barzillai Frost did live out his call. He loved and cared for his people. Emerson hated pastoral calls and giving communion. Emerson was once asked to leave the bedside of a dying parishioner by the guy who was dying. Frost lived out his values in his community by working towards causes he felt passionately about. His faith called him to act in the world. And when he was a minister, Emerson had to be dragged out into the community. You may not like or agree with Barzillai Frost's ideas and doctrines, but he lived them out. His actions were consistent with his belief. His was an authentic faith. Now, I hope Dave's feeling okay. We did have some Wi-Fi issues this week, but be on the lookout, for I've come to the point in the sermon now where I'm going to critique Emerson. Any number of things might go wrong. Maybe the enraged spirit of Ralph Waldo Emerson will send a pair of freak snowstorms to Southeast Michigan and New York's Hudson Valley just to show who is real and who is merely spectral. Well, at any rate, we will proceed henceforth with caution. Now, to be fair, I find Emerson to be pretty inspiring and his theology to be an invigorating force in the history of Unitarian Universalism. But we also have to admit that we cherry pick Emerson like crazy. He was the ultimate individualist. In his essay, Self-Reliance, we love to quote the famous lines, "Whoso should be a man must be a nonconformist," and "Foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." All very inspiring stuff. We rarely talk about the passage in the middle of those two famous quotes. One is the beginning of the paragraph, one is the end of the paragraph. We tend to skip over the middle of that paragraph where he basically says, don't give money or charity to help people in need. He even admits that the societal pressure to give to these worthy causes even gets to him. Quote, "I confess with shame that I sometimes succumb and give the dollar. It is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold." End quote. We know Emerson loved nature, but he didn't think too highly of human society. He felt that nations and communities were a form of peer pressure to conform to a formalized standard that was arbitrary and rote. It killed self-expression. Institutions, especially the church, were the worst at killing that spirit. Quote, "It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." End quote. Be who you are, no matter what, even if the rest of the crowd disagrees. The problem is that nowadays we don't call that self-reliance. We call that being a jerk to people. That is basically thinking of yourself first above others, counting yourself, your comfort, your privileged way of looking at and moving at the world above all of the other people around you. As George Costanza proclaimed after he had been wronged in the Chinese restaurant, you know, we're living in a society here, right? Emerson would have been prime fodder for George's complaint. Emerson's focus on the self can at times feel empowering and liberating, but he goes so far to the extreme with it that he forgets that our values and our actions affect other people, whether we like it or not. Which is why we need to have things like such as an eighth principle. We have to cast a vision of anti-racism before ourselves collectively if we're to be effective in the actual work of dismantling white supremacy. It's a spiritual act, an act consistent with our faith, because working toward anti-racism acknowledges that we are connected to each other. Just as Emerson would argue that we need to be true to ourselves and the spiritual insights that come to us, we also need to understand how we are accountable to the people around us. Both things are true. My critique of Emerson really comes down to wanting him to acknowledge that, yes, we do live in a society. Our actions do affect other people, and we can't just do anything we want, be it centering white experiences or skipping the line for a payphone just because we feel like it. A truly authentic faith understands that our actions and our values have to be in sync with each other. We're called to pass our lives through the fire of thought and see what comes out the other side. It's not easy. is a true spiritual discipline to live according to one's professed values and beliefs. Hypocrisy is tempting because it's easy. It's a form of freedom. It is life unhindered by honor, discipline, and character. However, Emerson's words and Barzeli Frost's actions both call us to live lives of authenticity. May we have the wisdom and the patience to take action in the world that lives up to our highest ideals, values, and principles. May we remember that we are not isolated dots buzzing around the universe, but connected to each other in love and caring, whether we recognize it every day or at least when we're together in beloved community. And may we never fail in striving for greater love and understanding in our world. I love you. Go in peace. Live with authenticity and faith. Amen. And blessed be. Do not fear the work of the world. Your strength lies within you. Fired by prophetic voices from the past and companions of today, step boldly onto the path which truth illumines.